Welcome everyone to our next episode of DC Thursday. I'm Pete from Data Council, and we're lucky enough to have an awesome guest today. It's Barr Moses, and Barr is the co-founder and CEO of a company called Monte Carlo in the data quality space. And Barr and I are going to have a conversation about various aspects of starting a data company, some interesting things on data observability and reliability, and some other interesting trends that she's seeing in the data world these days, including the data mesh and some other interesting topics. So Barr, welcome. I'm glad you're able to join us.
Thanks, Pete. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So I just wanted to remind the audience, for those who don't know you, of some of your background. You had an early career that was quite interesting in the Israeli Air Force, and I read something on your LinkedIn about how it seemed that you got into data even at that early stage in your career. I'm curious if you can share anything at all about the top secret work that you did for the Israeli Air Force.
Yeah, for sure. So I was born and raised in Israel. Actually, I lived in the Weizmann Institute of Science. So in the very early days, I actually hung out in my dad's. My dad is a physics professor, so I hung out in his lab, grew weird things in petri dishes, and tried to build my own lab and not blow myself up too much. But really just loved physics and math sort of as a kid. And then, in Israel at age 18, I was drafted to the Israeli Air Force. And you're really sort of, at a very young age, sort of thrown into the real world, right? You're given a ton of responsibility for many reasons, right? One, because of sort of the mission and why you're there. Two, because of the people that you were responsible for. So as a commander that was responsible for a group of soldiers, both for their professional and their personal training. And, the third reason is that, you're actually dealing with sort of real data that is used by units in the field. And that's a lot for an 18-year-old, right? And it was a very, obviously very unique experience. We were part of an air reconnaissance unit. So we analyzed data, obviously in very different techniques. This was almost 15 years ago. But, I think the impact of your work is very substantial. And in a very early part of my career, I learned about the importance of data quality and about the power of data to literally save lives, right? That was sort of the mission. And so that's, that was some of the very first experiences that I've had with data. And obviously, the importance of data quality, data reliability, and what that means for people's lives and for your impact is very significant.
That's great. And then from there, somehow you ended up at Stanford. And I know that you were in the Stanford Research Lab for stats, which was something, must have clicked for you to want to study stats. I'm curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, so moved to Stanford, which was a lot of fun. Honestly, it was a bit it felt like Disneyland for my brain. There were just so many awesome things to try out, so many fun things, and just spent a lot of time sort of with math and stats, Monte Carlo simulations in particular, and just had a great experience. It was quite intense as well, I have to say, but really appreciated kind of the love, sort of the beauty of math and having sort of a pen and paper. If anyone remembers the day when you actually used a pencil to write things. Just really loved my time there. One of my favorite classes was a class called Mathemagics, where sort of the combination of magic tricks and mathematical algorithms. One of the exercise or sort of projects for the class was to come up with a magic trick based on a mathematical algorithm. There's also a book called Mathemagics, actually, by the professor Percy Diakonis, which I recommend checking out if folks are curious.
So what magic trick did you come up with? I'm dying to know.
Oh, great question. I wish I remember. This was such a long time ago. I've had to follow up on that. I actually don't remember.
Okay, no problem. Well, you also spent some time at Gainsight, and I think that there's a lot about that experience that probably affected the way you've approached starting a company, which I want to get into later. So we'll dig into that part of your experience in a bit.
Yeah.
But what was it that specifically led you to want to start Monte Carlo Data?
Yeah. So I joined Gainsight, several years after, when sort of the customer success industry was in its very early days, and was fortunate to be there at Gainsight when we sort of created the customer success category. At Gainsight, built a number of different teams. Was fortunate to work with great people, and was responsible for the team that was managing sort of customer data. We called it Gainsight on Gainsight, so we called it like Gong for short. And we basically, our mission was to become sort of the best user of our internal data, so that we can serve as sort of a great example for our customers. That meant actually becoming data driven as an organization, which I think 3 to 5 years ago we sort of like to say that, but we didn't actually mean that. Many companies, say that they're data driven, but not truly. I think today we mean it more, like we actually mean it when we say it. That was pretty new for us, actually becoming data driven, actually using data to make decisions, to power new products. And one of the things that was hardest for me and for my team was that oftentimes data broke. And by that, I mean something looked off for a number of reasons, but for some reason the data looked wrong, and we weren't the first to catch it. Actually, we were notified about it from someone else. For example, someone in marketing who was using reports to power a campaign, or maybe it was my CEO who was looking at usage patterns for our customers. Or maybe it was our CFO who was looking at sort of bookings or closed revenue from the quarter. And oftentimes when we heard about these issues from other people, that was really frustrating. It was incredibly frustrating. And on top of that, once we heard that there are issues, it sort of threw us into this spin where we basically had to go figure out what exactly went wrong. Like, did the report not refresh? Did someone change the definition of the field? Was someone not using the right field? Was the table upstream actually the wrong table to use? Was it a table that should have been deprecated? Was there a source upstream that just stopped sending information and we didn't know? There could be so many different reasons. And so we actually spent some, detective work to start unpeeling the onion and figuring out where are the steps. And just found ourselves spinning wheels on that, and being, frustrated by our inability to know about these things before they happen and actually prevent them to begin with. I think when this situation, you sort of ask yourself, am I crazy? Is the world crazy? How is there no solution for this? How is this is the way that we should be doing this? And I remember sort of talking about this with my team and asking, what are we doing wrong here? That was some of the kind of experiences at Gainsight that led me to think, when organizations are trying to truly become data-driven, how are they managing this, right? Are we the only folks that are running into these issues, or is there anyone else who's experiencing that?
Mm-hmm. And was anyone using the term data observability at the time?
Not at all, actually, not at all. The very first term actually that we came up with was data downtime, which was a corollary to application downtime. And actually, I think the very first time that we tried out that term was in a data council. In a data council conference, when I think this was a few years ago. And I remember asking that, thinking, okay, I'm going to go talk about data downtime. Probably no one's going to care. I was I'm probably going to show up and there's going to be 2 people and it's just going to be me and them, and we'll have a great in-depth discussion. And I remember actually being really surprised by the response. There was good attendance. A lot of people could have sort of asking questions and saying, this concept resonates. We've experienced data downtime. It's something that happens to anyone in data. And it's actually really helpful to have terminology and language to help us describe what this is and to help us take this to other stakeholders in the organization to communicate the importance of this problem.
Well, that's really personally gratifying to hear. I have to say, it seems like there's lots of founders out there who have popped up at the conference over the years and have tested terms and tested concepts and tested marketing spiels, just to see what resonates with the audience. Because, as you know, there's such amazing people in our community, and we're fortunate to have lots of cutting edge folks who are really focused on the bleeding edge and what the future of data looks like across all layers of the stack. So that's really great. Thanks for mentioning that, because you had not specifically told me that before. So I'm really pleased to hear that the community in the conference was helpful and in some way validating for you.
100%. Very grateful for that. It was, the beginning of data downtime.
That's great. That's great. And so then you kind of switched a little bit more to observability, maybe
Yep.
do you talk about data reliability as well? Are those terms interchangeable for you, or is there any meaningful distinction?
Yeah. So I think in data, there's a lot of jargon, right? So we gotta like be careful with, not throwing too many words that don't mean much, right? Very well aware of that. The reason why we use these words is because it's helpful to think about what the problem is. I think if you define the problem well, then it's easier to define the solution, if that makes sense. And so I can actually walk through our thought process. When we were thinking through, okay, data breaks, right? Why is it breaking? There could be a million different reasons. What's another space, or what's another domain area where something like this happens? Oh, if you look at application downtime, actually that's a good corollary. Let's think through that, right? Like, applications or infrastructure can break for a million different reasons, right? It could be like a bug, an engineer made a change. So many things can happen. And so, what do we do about that? We track that as application downtime. Okay, cool. Now, what is a solution, right? How do you actually, or like, what's the optimal state? Optimal state is when you have a reliable infrastructure, reliable applications. Okay, how do we get there? We get there by creating observability into or observability around your infrastructure so that you can get reliable applications. Awesome. That makes sense. Can we apply the same thing to data? Why are we not applying the same thing to data? And if you take that, it actually makes a lot of sense, right? Data can be down, or you can get data downtime for a million different reasons. It could be, someone made a change, which then resulted in all of your data with, a higher null percentage than you expect, or, maybe, a credit card field turns into, suddenly have letters instead of numbers, right? There could be a million different reasons, but in order to make sure that your data is reliable, we need to create data observability. We need to create a view into the health of your data to help make sure that you can trust it. And that's how we actually define data observability. And in working with our customers, we help them achieve more reliable data that they can trust, data that they can use. Being able to sleep well at night and not worrying about waking up and hearing from your CEO that something went wrong in your product or in your dashboard.
And you weren't seeing this functionality being built out in current APM systems in Datadog and New Relic. Why do you think that is? Why is there a gap there for those companies? And is there anything that prevents them from getting into this space, or sort of what was your analysis of, why they didn't seem to have data monitoring features per se?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things. One, the primary users of APM, infrastructure monitoring, application monitoring, are engineering teams, right? And data teams oftentimes actually, don't use those solutions, use different solutions. So it's a different persona, right? It's different teams with different needs and different pains. And I think it's very important, especially in today's world, that products and solutions solve problems for particular people, right? And so designing products with the end user in mind, what do they care about? What do they wake up responsible for, right? That's a very different perspective or different product from the experience perspective. So one very different group of people that just has different pain points. And coming from customer success, I know how important it is to start with the person in mind versus starting with the solution in mind. So if you start with a technical product and try to like readapt that to someone, that's very different than starting with the persona and their pain, and then truly enabling them and empowering them to solve the data reliability problem. And then the second thing that I would say is that what you measure when you're looking for infrastructure and app reliability is very different than what you measure from data observability, which, by the way, we had to define, right? Because it's very clear what to measure in infrastructure and application observability, right? Like any engineering team would know what to measure and would have specific SLAs and SLOs for uptime. But in data observability, what are you going to measure, right? That's not defined. So what we did was we spoke to over 150 or so organizations, ranging from small startups to large companies like Netflix and Uber and Facebook, and just asked them, like, have you had data downtime? What does that look like? What are the main root causes? How do you solve those? What have you done to deal with that? And then we took all of that and we codified that into what we call the 5 pillars of data observability. And those 5 pillars, we believe that if you have sort of the instrumentation, monitoring, and tracking of those pillars, you reach that sort of, you get a holistic view of the health of your data, and you can trust your data.
Mm-hmm. And so you decided to build your own product, and hence Monte Carlo Data was born.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I think for any company where decision making sort of relies on data, or digital products rely on data, data trust is a very important thing. Like, the worst thing that can happen is for you to not be able to trust your data. I think we have great solutions and great ways to collect, store, process data. We've developed that over the last decade or so. We have not gotten to a point as an industry where we know how to use the data or how to trust it. And that's what we're here to do. We sort of call it the good pipelines, bad data problem, right? We have great pipelines, awesome infrastructure, but the data itself that's powering it is actually oftentimes wrong.
And why do you think it's complicated for companies to address this problem? Is it because of a thought process, or assumptions that they make, or lack of tools, or all of the above? Like, what are the key reasons that make this difficult for companies to manage?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, this problem is becoming more sort of serious and grave as we're relying on more and more in data. So honestly, I think this isn't a new problem, right? Like 5 to 10 years ago, this problem still existed, but it was limited in scope and limited in the number of people that actually care about it. So you often had all of your data in one database, and you created sort of an Excel report once a quarter and used that to report financial earnings or something like that. And you had like a fair amount of people who could manually like validate that the data looks right, and that you can trust it. And you did that like once a quarter. That's a very different reality today, in which organizations are trying to have, they're building data platform teams. They have data engineering teams, data science, data analyst teams. And on top of that, each of the functions, marketing, customer success, sales, all those organizations are also becoming data driven. So first of all, just the sheer amount of people that have their hands in data and rely on data has grown immensely, right? That's one thing that's become really hard. The second thing that's become hard is just relying on way more data sources, right? It could be like thousands of data sources. And then the question is, even if you sort of understood that this isn't something that you want to manage, how do you actually solve this technically, right? So in today's world, just to list out a couple of things that you need to do, you have at least 2 to 3, if not more, data warehouses, data lakes, BI tools, which you need to instrument. Sometimes many more in order to do something like this. Then you need some scalable way to actually process logs, metadata, and metrics about your data, right? Everything that you need in order to create strong observability. Then you need to build some machine learning to do anomaly detection and actually fine tune that so that you get like a good signal to noise ratio, right? So because alert fatigue is a big deal for data teams, and you want to make sure that what you're alerting on is actually meaningful. Then you need to reverse engineer metadata and logs to actually like build out lineage and dependencies across assets, right? Which is also its task. And so, I can go on and on, but basically like this is just requires kind of a, combination of engineering, data science, and product work to build this and then to maintain it. And so that's why we mostly see folks kind of looking for solutions for this once they've sort of realized that this is kind of a problem that can be solved.
Got it. Well, it's fascinating when you get to be in a situation where you're creating, helping create a new market and a new piece of sort of infrastructure ops tooling, like you are in this category. And as you and I have spoken before, I think that it seems that one of your key superpowers in being able to do this was really sort of learned through the Gainsight process. And as you said before, being really laser focused on the customer, the user, the persona, how they're doing it now versus how they maybe, haven't even dreamed they could do it better. What were you seeing, like in terms of how the potential customers were solving the problem at the moment, before Monte Carlo? What sorts of solutions were you seeing?
Yeah. So, I was, I mentioned, like really fortunate to be at Gainsight and sort of see kind of the customer success category and come together and the community come together and have a ton of sort of lesson learned and things that, excited to bring to Monte Carlo and how we work with our customers today. Like customer success is a huge part of our company. Not just in the fact that like we've had a customer success function from day one, basically, but also that every function in the company from product engineering, marketing, sales, et cetera, data science is customer obsessed and is sort of, I can share some examples of that too, but that's definitely something that's an extremely important thing for us as a company, putting our customers first. To your question specifically, what were people sort of doing before, kind of like how were they thinking about this before? There's probably two main ways. One is and I assume you're asking how they were dealing with the data downtime problem. And so there were two main ways. One is actually manually validating data. So, something like, always having 2 to 3 sets of eyes on data before anyone uses it, right? It was super common to do that. We did that too, right? We basically had a team where every morning, someone on my team, his name was Will Robbins, would wake up and, basically validate that the top 5 to 6 sort of steps in a key transformation that was feeding kind of data that executives were looking at every morning, that the numbers all like check out, just like quick sanity checks, right? I spoke with a chief data officer at, an e-commerce platform company that told me that she would manually like validate the reports up until her team was about 30 people or so. And so super common. That's probably the sort of the main thing that folks have been doing. The other thing that folks started doing is we actually sort of plot this and kind of we call kind of a maturity curve in terms of how people started to deal with this. And so the very first stage is kind of reactive, where you really don't have anything to deal with this. The second is proactive, where you start managing this. And so sometimes this could be with manual validation, and sometimes it could be with really sort of basic checks in place, just like counting rows, making sure that the number of rows that you have today is similar to the number of rows you had yesterday. Those are the things that people have started doing mostly, kind of like bits of pieces. I mentioned there's like the 5 data observability pillars. So I'll just name them, but the first is freshness. So everything about kind of like the timeliness of the data. The second is volume, so like, is this complete set of data? The third is distribution. So at the field level, is the data what I expect it to be in terms of like uniqueness and null rates, et cetera. The fourth is schema. So, the structure of the data, fields added, removed. And then the fifth is lineage. So table, field level dependencies, upstream and downstream assets. And so some companies, start doing parts of this. Row count could be a very basic example of something under distribution. That was a long answer to your question.
No, I get it. And it seems like to the companies that were trying to attack this and build stuff internally, they'd probably end up with this whole, messy like ball of shell scripts that were being cron to run against, to do some of these basic checks. And I think we've all heard stories of that. And of course, it's not really a system, like a set of scripts like that can be very unwieldy to manage, of course, over time. So we can all see how that wouldn't scale. So, well, that's interesting. And what were the other key, like back to the sort of customer development process, because we have a lot of founders in our community who are looking to start new data companies as well. What were some of the key insights that you gained regarding bringing a B2B product to market in this space? Like, what were your earliest sort of steps to engage customers, potential customers? How did you have those conversations, and what did you learn from that process? In case there's insights here that other folks who are listening can glean from.
Yeah, so I think in the early days before this, before we even had a company, the very first thing that I did and that was the most helpful was just spend a lot of time with customers, and spend a lot of time with customers and learn how to have a conversation with them that is not biased, which I think is really hard. There's this book, it's called The Mom Test.
The Mom Test. Yes, great one.
And for folks who haven't read it, the idea there is that, if you take an idea to, anyone who's close to you and loves you, whether it's your mom, your dad, whoever it is, and you ask them like, hey, what do you think about this idea? I came up with this idea. And, they love you and they care about you. So they're gonna be like, oh, it's an amazing idea. Even if it's like the worst idea in the world, right? They will still be like, amazing. You're the best. You should definitely like start that company. And that's true for most people who know you. Actually, as human beings, we tend to get excited and want to help people. And so the question is, how do you choose people who actually pass this test? And how do you ask them questions that help them pass this test? And so at the beginning, I spoke to all these people who were like, yeah, of course, amazing idea. And I was like, okay, definitely not passing the test here.
Right. Are these people really objective, right? Is kind of the question. Yeah, right.
Yeah, exactly. Is there something unconscious in which they're, excited about you? And so they want to be positive, which can be really confusing as a founder in the early days, right? You're like, oh, people are so excited. But actually, are they going to use a product like this? Is it going to solve something meaningful for them? Do they really care about this? I think the thing that like kills startups the mostly is like when people just don't care about what you're doing, right? And so you need to find something that people actually care about. They can, have strong negative or strong positive feelings about it, but at least they care. That's the thing to find. And so I, worked hard to find people who like didn't know me, didn't owe anything, and actually got some like strong reactions. Like I remember, I had like cold called the CTO of this, large ad tech company, and showed to him some like mock-ups or slides of product. And I remember him telling me like, okay, your slides are complete shit, excuse my language, but the product is awesome and I would use it tomorrow. And I was like, oh, interesting. What an interesting reaction, right? And so sort of listening, really being sort of in tune to what the people that you're asking questions of, like what keeps them up at night? What do they really care about? What's the biggest pain point for them? If they had a magic wand and they could solve something tomorrow, what would that be? And so starting with the customer pain point and not with a technical solution that you would then apply to that was one of the most important thing that we did. And then speaking to lots of people and understanding their point of view and letting our customers or letting the market actually help us define what the problem is from day one was really important. So I think it comes back to sort of customer obsession from day one. That's in the very, very early stages.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that's a great book. I'm glad that you brought it up. I think all aspiring founders out there should definitely pick up a copy of the Mom Test. Well, I want to mention to folks in the audience that if they have questions for Barr, to jump in the chat, and we'll try to fit your questions in, whether it's regarding data observability, the space, or other things regarding starting a company. Please feel to jump in. And so, Barr, I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about another hot topic in the data world right now. Tell us about the data mesh and what this means, because this is a new term that's just starting to kind of pop its head up, and I hear folks talking about it. Give us your take on on what the importance of the data mesh is and sort of how folks can be thinking about that.
Yeah, so data mesh, which I think the first, it was first coined by Zhamak Dehghani at ThoughtWorks. I love this concept. I think it's pretty simple, which is why it's actually genius. And it draws actually on some of the things that we talked earlier about. So, earlier we talked about how there are lessons that we can apply from software engineering to data. And data mesh at its root really draws around that, right? And the corollary here is in software engineering, we've moved from monolith to distributed architectures. And so in the same way in data, in the past, we should have talked a little bit about this, we had sort of one big data lake or database with all of our data. That's not working anymore today. And so we need to move from that sort of approach to an approach where data is actually distributed and we have domain-specific consumers and owners of data. And the idea is that when you have sort of this centralized place to manage all of your data, it's really hard to do what we're trying to do, which is get everyone in the company to use data, right? It puts a very significant toll on this centralized team, to build sort of all the pipelines, run all of the queries, support all of the data in this very, very centralized way, when actually like the way that you use data today is very use case specific. So the way that you're using data in marketing to drive a campaign is totally different from how product and engineering is using your data to power, recommendation algorithm, or how your sales team is using data to make a decision about a prospect and a churn analysis, for an example. And so the idea that like all the data is centralized in one place and there's only sort of one way to take the data and transform it and then make it accessible is not scalable at all. And actually makes it very hard to do what we're trying to do as an industry, which is get more folks to use data and to become data driven. And so the idea here is that you can actually you can sort of view data as a product, if you will, where you actually have sort of a centralized place to align on standards of data, but then have each sort of domain owner handle their own data pipelines, their own sort of data outputs, if you will, and then and let them manage that. And that requires a different architecture. It requires a standardization of communication around how we do this, and some self-serve functionality, right? I think the idea makes a lot of sense to me. I think to many folks in the industry, we are early in sort of the process, or early as an industry to get there. And I think we're moving towards there, but we're definitely in the early stages of figuring out how to apply this and how to implement this for organizations.
Yeah, that makes sense. So the idea is to basically sort of allow different repositories of data to be spread across the org, presumably under the care of different teams that are managing them. I guess
that's right.
There's a couple things that come to mind there. One is that it still seems like there's some sort of federated governance, access control, security layer that might still be required. And then the second thing is that how does Conway's law sort of work here, where your organization is basically sort of your org structure is a mirror image of the way your tech systems are built. And so it seems to me that if we move towards this data mesh concept, the team, the core data platform team, becomes something that potentially gets sort of atomized into different parts of the organization. Have you thought about the org structure and sort of like what this might mean from the data mesh perspective?
Yeah, I think a data mesh actually mandates two things when it comes to that. One is you're spot on. There has to be a strong centralized platform team that does standardize on governance, formatting, communication, discoverability, metadata, right? You need to have that sort of core components. Other things that I think this mandates is, things like you mentioned, like security, encryption, versioning, right? And also monitoring and quality and observability, right? I think those are things that need to be adopted as best practices, because once you sort of democratize the data, you are allowing more degrees of freedom, and you're allowing more, more people more consumers to use this data. And so, in a way, you actually need to specify stricter guidelines in some sense. And then on the org structure, on top of this, centralized group, each domain specific data consumer or data owner that manages their own data pipelines need to be equipped with self-serve ways to manage this, right? So it's very hard to expect someone to be responsible for data, but not help them answer questions like, when was this data last updated, right? If I'm sort of I own the data for marketing, say, and I don't know where this data came from. When was it updated? Who's using it? When was the last time it was refreshed? Is it complete? Those are some questions that I need to be equipped to be able to answer in order to do that. And so there needs to be also thinking around, how do we empower each of these organizations and each of these distributed teams to actually to support that. And it's interesting because in today's organizations, data is already very much distributed across these teams, but the way that we manage the data is not quite distributed yet. And so I think that those are some of the key parts to enabling the right structure and the right sort of people setup.
Yeah, I agree. And it looks like our audience is on the same page, because Wyatt had just jumped in the chat and asked us essentially the same question. So,
oh, no
Wyatt,
way.
Well, so Wyatt, I hope we answered that to your satisfaction. But Barr, another sort of extrapolation of that then, and I think you mentioned it, is this whole notion of the metadata layer, right? So the metadata layer becomes even arguably more important, and even this term metadata layer is kind of a new thing that's being tossed around now by various projects. It seems like it's even more important in this data mesh world. Talk to us about how you think the metadata layer and the data mesh play together, and why those maybe those are two things whose time has come.
Yeah, it's like the rise of metadata now, I think, right? I think it's interesting, right? Because in the last 5 to 10 years, we've sort of seen the rise of data. I think people call like the next decade the decade of data. And we've gotten really good at sort of collecting, aggregating, and storing data. We actually have, someone might say, too much data, and we're not sure how to use it. Now we're getting all excited about metadata, and now we're like, let's collect all the metadata we can, extract everything, go all in on metadata. And then the question is a little bit like, okay, what do we do with it now, right? So I have this like beautiful map of lineage, and I know all of my assets. And I can understand how all the tables relate to each other, and they all connect together, and that's awesome. What am I supposed to do with this now? I showed it to my manager, and she got excited, and we moved on. I think there's a risk sort of with this kind of like metadata theme, is that we collect a lot of it and actually not put it to good use. I think it's awesome we use it. I actually think it's great because in recent years, we can actually automate a lot of the metadata collection. So in the past, it was, in order to create sort of a view of your lineage, table level dependency, you had to actually manually map it out. So you had to tap the shoulder of, your friendly data engineer, data analyst, and ask like, hey, like, what are the data sources that are, feeding this table, and, all those questions. And today you can actually extract that automatically. So that's a great advantage that helps us get more metadata. But I think the key here is actually applying metadata to a particular use case. Going back to sort of what we talked about, like starting with the customer pain point. If I'm the data team that's responsible for enabling other people in the organization to use data, how are they going to use metadata, or how should our data team actually use data? What are we going to do with lineage, for example? And so lineage actually becomes powerful when you want to ask questions like, I'm going to make a change to a particular table here, or a particular field, or I want to deprecate this table. Is anyone going to care? Right? Is there anyone downstream who's looking out and listening, or are using this table? Maybe there's like zero downstream dependencies, and I can just deprecate a table. It's not a big deal. But maybe there's like thousands of dependencies and lots of users querying it every day, and in that case, a change can be way more impactful. So once you actually use metadata or lineage for a particular business question, I think that's where the power of metadata actually lies. And I think we'll see more and more powerful applications of metadata when they are applied to particular pain points that we have in the data industry. We have a lot of pain points. There's a lot of things to solve. And I'm excited to see how we apply better use of the combination of data and data about our data to solve some of these problems.
Yeah, agreed. I think the metadata layer needs to power specific use cases, applications on top of it for it to be really meaningful, which is why a lot of the companies in our community are working on sort of point solutions of applications and they sort of end up backing into the metadata implementation manifestation to power their own product. I think it's been interesting now to see a couple companies that are popping up and trying to go at it from the bottom up. So we'll see like where we all meet in the middle and how that happens, but it's definitely a new and interesting space, and I think there's a lot to watch out for. That's exciting there.
For sure.
We have another question. Rich is asking, data mesh as a concept relies heavily on distributed sources. Does this imply architecture where source data remains in place, or is a virtualized architecture possible? Do you have any thoughts on virtualization as it applies to the data mesh?
Yeah, great question. I never got that question. I probably have to think about that. I think in terms of how we think about the structure of sort of the architecture itself, I think the most important thing is to think about, how do you abstract some of the problems from the data consumers themselves. And so if you have sort of the centralized platform that is aligned on some of these standards, then you can definitely empower your data consumers to focus only on their, on the use cases that they care about. And that means the sources that they rely on in particular, and maybe not all of the sources that feed sort of the data platform. But it's a good question.
Yeah, maybe something for us to watch out for as the whole data mesh situation evolves.
Yeah, I think there's actually a need for more and more kind of folks trying out and experimenting with this and building more of this sort of data mesh architecture. And so I'm really, really eager to see more folks contribute to this in the space, and on the lookout for some great examples. So if folks want to share or contribute or even collaborate, would love to hear from folks.
Yeah, absolutely. And it looks like Wyatt has a follow-up question on data mesh. How do you think the data mesh is different from something like Kimball's Data Mart? Is this another pattern occurring in the industry where we cycle between distributed versus centralized? Well, isn't everything a pattern in the industry where we're cycling between distributed and centralized? But maybe you have some other thoughts there as well, Barr.
Yeah, so it's a great question, because that's maybe one thing that we see that's constant, this sort of oscillating between distributed and centralized, and we see that with organizations. It typically actually follows a company's sort of journey in what we call their data lifecycle. So in the very early days, it is more common to have a centralized team that is responsible for all of your data needs, especially as an organization is small or a company is small. And then there's this point where the company sort of organization becomes bigger, and then suddenly there's a need for more support for the different data consumers, and so then you start seeing data analysts and data scientists being embedded within each of these teams. And so that, sort of moving to more distributed. And then, as the company continues to grow and mature, then suddenly, there's this like, oh shit moment where like, it's sort of a mess. We've tried to democratize data. We let everyone sort of run free with it. We got to like rein it in. And then there's sort of a centralized team back again. And then, I think this sort of, continue to oscillate a little bit as organizations change. I think, the data mesh again is as a concept is one that sort of probably brings the best of both of those worlds, but we need to see more examples of it in the wild, if you will.
Yeah, agreed. It's still early days for sure.
Yeah.
So someone else is asking a Monte Carlo question. Ooh, maybe we'll get an expose on some up and coming features of Monte Carlo if we play our cards right. Let's see. Alessio is asking, do you see Monte Carlo expanding towards ML monitoring, model monitoring in the future?
Yeah, great question. So definitely, if I think about the category, right? I think about like data observability, data reliability, it certainly spans the problem of ML monitoring for sure, right? Like if you want to sort of trust your data wherever it is, it doesn't matter if it's in your product, in your BI solution, in a machine learning model, whatever it is. So I think in order to achieve real data observability or real reliability of your data, it has to include, your machine learning products as well. For us in particular, we sort of think about the reliability of the data powering that, and we do support that. But I think, again, going back to sort of the category and what we need to figure out as an industry, I think that requires sort of powering your data wherever it is.
Got it. It seems like in the ML model monitoring world, there's sort of a whole new set of types of ways the model can go awry. It can be skewed, or there can be drift, or it can be biased, and there can be all kinds of things that may or may not map directly. I mean, I guess everything ultimately maps to the training data, but I'm sure you've thought of this. There might be sort of additional expressions required to be able to sort of cover all the different ways a model could go wrong that are very nuanced when it comes to, other null checks or freshness checks in the origin data itself. So I'm curious to hear, as your product develops, how you think of that in the future.
Yeah, most definitely. I think this is something that we sort of are evolving with our customers, right? Sort of going back to sort of customer obsession. As our customers as we're seeing more and more organizations use machine learning, deployed in production, we sort of plan to obviously support them in their needs. But, I think one of the interesting things here is kind of the bias point that you mentioned. And there's more and more work on that, which is interesting too. Curious if maybe that's top of mind for folks, but those are one of the areas that I'm seeing more interesting things come up. I think this is another area where it's the early days, similar to data mesh. Data observability is in its beginnings, and so we're defining that, and we're defining what that means, especially in models. So, I'm excited to see where we take this as an industry.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Barr, it's really great to have you in the community and have you in the space and building a company. I really respect what you guys are up to. And this has been a fun conversation. I just wanted to ask you, as we sort of close, what's the thing that surprised you most about your work in the data ecosystem so far?
That's a great question. I think probably the thing that I've been most amazed by is sort of the strong reception, actually, of both this problem and the solution, sort of data observability. The responses that we get from the community, whether it's from back then, that talk, the data downtime that we, had at Data Council a few years ago, back to sort of, customers today who, were able to bring real value to and to solve their lives. When we kind of are able to help them, sort of catch an issue before anyone else does, or find a bug, before it impacts production, or better yet, actually like help them prevent issues to begin with. Those are some of the things that sort of get me excited to wake up in the morning, and I've been surprised by the strong reactions from people, and by how quickly folks are adopting the concepts of data observability and data reliability. And I've been really impressed by how fast we're as an industry adopting these concepts.
Yeah, it's great as a founder when you step into a emerging market that really needs a solution that you have to offer. And so I know there's no other feeling that's quite like that. So congratulations on finding that, and we look forward to seeing how you and the company develop going forward.
Thanks, and thanks again for the Data Council community. We have a sweet spot, soft spot in our heart for the community, and so.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
We're looking forward to getting people back together IRL as soon as we can.
For sure.
Just so that folks come to me every week and ask when the next conference is going to be, and we're anxiously awaiting the time that we can announce that. So just a heads up.
Yeah, we want to stay healthy until then.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to make a couple of quick comments and announcements afterwards. First of all, we're really grateful to have IBM, who's been a sponsor of DC Thursdays since we launched. They've been supporting us behind the scenes. They're a big supporter of open source software, and you can check out their data science community online, which has some great resources, open source, and other content for data professionals. So make sure to check out the IBM data science community. And also, don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel, and that way you'll get notifications of our upcoming episodes. Speaking of upcoming episodes, I'm really excited to have Jennifer Prenke on with us next time on February 18th. She'll be talking about active learning. Jennifer is one of the most leading, foremost researchers in active learning in the world, and she's starting a company around active learning. So we'll be excited to chat with Jennifer in about 2 weeks. And then finally, leave us comments if you have a minute. We'd love to hear what you're thinking. I have office hours scheduled. I think there's a couple slots open if founders want to chat about starting a data-oriented company. I'm happy to help them out in any way that I can. And you'll find all of these links in the chat bar on the right.